And our next speaker is Tanya Southcott. She's a doctoral student in the School of Architecture at McGill University. Her current research explores architectural photography and the intersection between demolition and memory in the context of Montreal following the Second World War. Her background is not only in architecture, also in heritage conservation, also the environmental sciences. She's worked in both architectural and heritage consulting offices across Canada and the United Kingdom, as well as archaeological excavations in Turkey. And she's written for several architectural publications, including Canadian Architect, Architecture BC, and Heritage BC. She'll be speaking today on the Montreal-based amateur photographer Edith Mather. Welcome.
So I'd just like to say that, to begin with, that I'm really honored to be part of such an inspiring panel and a conference. And I'm also really happy to be able to hopefully introduce you to the work of Edith Mather, a relatively new acquisition at the McCord Museum, and so far little studied. So, from 1966 to 1985, Edith Mather, an amateur Montreal-based photographer, walked the city's downtown neighborhoods with a seemingly singular purpose: to document the evolving streetscape. Embedded in her domestic routine, she began these walks each morning by packing a pram with her young son, camera, and supplies, and returned home each evening to meticulously record the places they visited. The resulting collection of over 4,000 images reveals the city through candid, black and white photographs that Mather developed and printed in her home darkroom, then annotated and cataloged in a series of handmade albums that she donated to Montreal's McCord Museum in 2012. While her photographs reflect the broader social and political contexts in which they were formed, they are also acts of self-representation, documenting a highly individual endeavor, much like keeping a personal diary. Capturing the intersection between personal experience and the collective memory of a place, Mather extends the self-portrait to the scale of the city, using her photographs to reinsert herself into a rapidly transforming world. In this presentation, I wish to explore some of the many ways in which the self-representation of Edith Mather and the city of Montreal are analogous in the Mather collection. Locked in the visual narrative of these photographs is a unique spatial story that is intimately tied to her biographical context. Her use and documentation of space not only describe her perception of Montreal during this time, they are tools she uses to construct her identity. Fragmented rather than complete, cyclical rather than linear, and rooted in everyday practices, this collection offers a rich framework for describing the intersecting lives of people and places. On a recent visit to the museum's documentation center, the senior cataloger of the photo archives was excited by our shared affinity for this recent and little-studied collection. Edith photographed just about anything anyone would want to take a picture of, she said, a comment which took me back to my first visit a few years earlier. That day, with equal enthusiasm, she remarked, "It was as though Edith knew exactly what would be missing from our collection. Before her, we just didn't have anything like this for Montreal during that time." What did she mean by these comments, and where does Mather's project fit? The Edith Mather collection includes 4,293 photographs of Montreal's built environment spanning almost 2 decades. They are all exterior shots taken from the vantage of the sidewalk with her handheld camera. Her views vary in scale, alternating between individual buildings, street scenes, or long-distance views and architectural details. They are linked by her preference for the 19th century Victorian era buildings rather than new modernist construction popularized during this time, and by her handwritten notations that appear both on the back of individual photographs and in the album indexes. Here she describes the location of each shot, precisely locating her viewer in time and space. Beyond this temporal distance, nothing in the photographs is inaccessible or exclusive. Hers is the view of the individual, ordinary observer of the city during a transformative period of its history. Curiously, this view, Mather's view, had filled a gap in a much celebrated and well-documented era of Montreal. Quebec entered the 1960s in the grips of modernism. Taken back to this tumultuous period, Canadian journalist Greta Chambers recalls, "For Quebecers, the 60s represents a clean break with the past. When one thinks back to those days, it is still hard to explain how century-old habits and customs vanished almost overnight. Nowhere was this sense of rupture more tangible than in the built environment of the province's largest and fastest growing city. In welcoming his colleagues from across the country to the 58th Annual Assembly of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, Montreal-based architect André Blouin described the city in 1965 as one great building project. Here, glass skyscrapers like Place Ville-Marie and Place Victoria rose from piles of rubble as soaring evidence of the spirit of Montreal. Through the imagery of architectural monumentality and progress, Montreal was launched into the international imagination as Canada's modern metropolis. The view from the street, however, was telltale. Mather's images are marked by the underbelly of this rapid transformation. Her photographs reveal streetscapes fractured by incongruities of scale, architectural style, and building materials. Austere skyscraping glass towers are uncomfortably juxtaposed with ornate gingerbread homes. Her celebration of Victorian craftsmanship is framed by empty sites or newly minted parking lots, and perhaps more palpable, the active destruction of 19th century buildings. Demolition was an inevitable experience of the urban citizen walking downtown Montreal, and while we might look at these images through the filter of a nostalgia for a city erased, in the 1960s this vantage was commonplace. On this particular visit, however, I wasn't looking for buildings per se. I was looking for Edith Mather, the woman behind the camera's lens. Rare are the images in her collection that portray people, but even rarer are the images of the artist herself. Sometimes caught in a reflection, often distorted beyond recognition, Mather is an elusive figure who seemingly resists grafting herself onto the city. Consider one of only 2 self-portraits in the entire collection. Entitled Edith Mather, mirrored 3 times, the photograph captures Mather's reflection in an urban storefront window, revealing her as a mother accompanied by her child in his pram on one of their many walks, this time along Notre Dame Street West. In this photograph, Mather is analogous to the disappearing city as she disappears and reappears through different versions of her real self. Her reflection reveals both the potential and the limitations of her lens. The closer we are to the original subject, Edith, the more complete the picture and the more legible she and the city are. But content dissolves through the distance of multiple reflections, and the images become increasingly abstract. She is at once located and dislocated in time and space. The process of relocation and dislocation of perceivable facts and absences is echoed in her representation of Montreal. To find the artist in this visual narrative of buildings and streets means delving deeper into her biographical context. Of the many roles assumed by Mather throughout this documentation project, mother is clearly the one she wears with the most pride. The birth of her son, Geoffrey, commonly referred to as GM in her handwritten notations, coincides with her earliest photographs in the collection. Several images track his first years from baby in pram to young toddler to active and curious boy. In these instances, the evolution of Montreal's streets plays background to her growing child, and caring for Geoffrey becomes central to the purpose of the project. Edith remembers these early days, saying, "I just liked walking, and I had this urge to take pictures, that's all. I had to take the baby for walks, and I just kept going." At a time when art was synonymous with freedom and artistic life associated with cafes, bars, and intimate music venues, Mather's daily routine was structured by her domestic duties. A natural extension to her role as mother is that of wife. Her husband, Brian McCarthy, a published poet with whom she met and married in 1964, appears in only one photograph, an impromptu family portrait of father and son relaxing on the swings in a neighborhood park. This personal narrative overlaid by Mather onto the city is both fragmented and incomplete. Born on March 8, 1925, Mather did not begin to take photographs until age 40, when she was introduced to the ease of the camera by a friend during a period of considerable transition in her personal life. Geoffrey was not her first child, but her fourth, and McCarthy her second husband. She had married Glyn Owen at age 20. Leaving her family home in Hampstead, the young couple moved into a boarding house together on Mackay Street in downtown Montreal. They relocated around the city, first to a flat in Côte Saint Paul and then to a house in Saint Lambert, as their family grew to include 3 children and Owen's mother and brother. Mather moved to Notre-Dame-de-Grâce following her divorce in 1960, and then to Westmount, an affluent Anglophone neighborhood, upon remarrying. Of the many buildings in and around Montreal she has called home, only one is documented in her collection, the Mather House at 5583 Queen Mary Road in Hampstead. Taken in 1984, this photo of a suburban bungalow surrounded by lush vegetation recalls a much earlier time in her life as the home of her childhood, the open window, her bedroom in the house where she lived with her parents. Now an affluent Anglophone suburb of Montreal, pre-war Hampstead was slow to develop. The former farmlands remained pastoral through her youth, filling her early memories with the play of young children from families like her own and the freedom of empty and abandoned fields. Returning to this site 40 years later, she collapses the distance between the physical space of 5583 Queen Mary Road and her memory of the Mather home into the frame of one image, attempting to reconcile her memories with their reality. This same sense of yearning for a past time through place is present in her documentation of 19th century buildings, specifically the mansions and middle-class townhouses in the Square Mile neighborhood, formerly Uptown or Newtown, at the foot of Mount Royal. Embedded in the built legacy of the previous century's commercial aristocracy, its architecture retained the whimsy and romance of the Victorian era, borrowing from a myriad of stylistic influences, often mixing historic periods for greater effect. Balconies with lathe-turned spindle balusters, tin cornices, plaster capitals, columns of various styles, and multicolored stained glass windows reflected a large craft industry that was waning by the early 20th century as architectural preferences shifted to more modern styles and materials. Now part of downtown Montreal, the area Mather moved into in the mid-1940s was a neighborhood in transition. The commercial district, originally concentrated in the Old Port, had stretched northwards, and changing demographics made these homes a challenge to occupy as originally intended, exposing them to the threat of demolition. These were the streets she returned to some 20 years later with her camera in hand in order to capture and catalog the buildings that remained in the patina of time. Despite the apparent coherence of her collection, Mather's narrative of Montreal, like that of her personal life, is fragmented and incomplete. Iconic structures such as Place Ville-Marie, the pavilions of Expo 67, Olympic Stadium, all constructed during these decades, are notably absent. Sites of demolition are instead prioritized, such that her streetscapes appear caught in evolution and incomplete. Even her documentation of individual buildings is fragmented. Consider her photographs of 1938 Dorchester Boulevard, the Casgrain House, former home of Thérèse Casgrain, the first woman to head a political party in the province of Quebec, an avid supporter of women's suffrage. Built in the late 19th century for F.W. Torrance, prominent Montreal lawyer and judge, 1938 Dorchester sat along the south boundary of the Square Mile on the edge of the Saint Jacques Escarpment. The house eluded demolition during the epic widening of Dorchester until 1969, when the site was finally cleared to build entry and exit ramps for the newly extended Ville-Marie Expressway. Mather began photographing the house in 1966, 3 years before demolition trucks moved in. Even in these early shots, her view of the house is obscured by the curve of Dorchester Boulevard, the low wall of an adjacent property, and the ornate iron fence surrounding the park across the street. In one photograph, she uses the ruins of other buildings to frame the Casgrain house, and as though foreshadowing its own fate. Once vacated, Mather is able to enter the property, and her view becomes the view out towards the transforming neighborhood. The final images of the house record the violence and vulnerability of its demolition. Shards of broken glass in empty windows and doors, one of the roof turrets ripped off, the exterior wall stripped of its stone facing. Mather's documentation of this building and others in the city is marked by an incessant need to return to a particular place over the course of many years. The cyclical behavior is recorded by photographs taken of the same site at different times, as well as by Mather's handwritten notations on the backs of the images and in the index of each album. Photographs, like sites, are revisited to update the building's status, for instance, after demolition, or to link the images to others in the series of albums. The intersection of Selby Street and Green Avenue offers another example just a few blocks away from the Casgrain house and Mather's home. Until the mid-1960s, Selby was a residential street lined with three-story brick and stone-faced buildings, typically composed of multiple rental units and occupied by sizable working-class families. It was an anomaly in picturesque Westmount, a neighborhood known for its grand, detached and semi-detached homes, generous gardens and parks. Located just south of the escarpment and the Canadian Pacific Railway, Selby Street coincided with the province's plans to extend the Trans-Canada Highway via the Ville-Marie Expressway through Westmount to downtown Montreal. 1965 began the long and drawn-out process by which Selby Street and its adjacent lands were expropriated, tenants evacuated, and eventually 239 homes demolished. The Battle of Selby was well documented in the local newspapers, a story that followed a clear linear structure from the announcement of the expressway to the natural climax and point of no return, the demolition of the homes. But Mather's photographs tell the story in an alternate way. She captures the different stages of the neighborhood's dissolution, from well-maintained homes with curtained windows and swept outdoor staircases, to stone facades marred by anti-auto route graffiti and broken windows, to fragments of buildings foregrounded by heavy machinery, and finally the edge of the new concrete superstructure dwarfing the remaining buildings. Grouped neither chronologically nor geographically, these images are scattered throughout various albums. Their relationship is not immediately apparent. Rather, they encourage the viewer to engage in a process of active visual literacy and memory. To find Selby Street in this collection, we must track recurring elements of the streetscape as they change or remain the same. Street signs and lampposts bring us back to the intersection that would otherwise be unrecognizable. Alternating textures of stone and subtle variation in windowsills and lintels help to identify which buildings remain. In this process, the changing scenery is measured against consistent habits. This balance of change and consistency encourages both Mather and her audience to return to places we have already been. Similarly, the photographs document the repetitive patterns of Mather's life in an everyday practice built on variations of the same activities: walking, photographing, annotating, developing, organizing, and cataloging. In 1966, Mather lived at the intersection of Green Avenue and St. Catherine Street in Westmount with her husband and son in a two-story flat above Oman's Jewelry. As comfortable as it was for their small family of three, its location at the tail end of the neighborhood's busiest commercial street was an invitation to leave, to join the activity of the sidewalk. Walking for Mather was liberating, but her concern was not the destination, but the process, and the everydayness of her photographs reflect this. She began each morning by packing a pram with her son, camera and supplies, and a snack for the day. The pram increased their mobility and could accommodate any resources she needed to stay away from home for longer periods of time. In these early days, she was learning to use a camera with no automatic metering system, and she meticulously recorded the location, date, time, and setting of each image she took as an instructive measure to better understand her camera's technology and improve her use of it. Eventually, she set up a darkroom in the spare bathroom on the lower level of their apartment. Here, in her workshop, she honed new skills by reframing and manipulating her negatives through the printing process. Organizing her collection of prints and negatives was a constant exercise, and the eventual donation of 33 handmade albums, meticulously indexed, an intensive process of selection and reselection drawn from a much larger collection. The enthusiasm, skill, and discipline of this archival work inspired her enrollment as a mature student at Concordia University, where she graduated in 1985 with a diploma in library studies and continued to work in the library for 25 years, binding and repairing damaged books. Thus, the Edith Mather collection documents an iterative process, not one walk, but a composite of walks built up over almost 50 years. Her well-traveled routes emerge through the repetition of elements, and her walks build a composite of the city itself. When Edith Mather donated her albums, photographs, and negatives to the McCord Museum on August 22, 2012, at the age of 87, she committed her collection to the public sphere. This gift transformed an accumulation of private documents into the self-portrait we have explored today. Our path through Mather's life and the city of Montreal has been circuitous, often repetitive, and our images of both may remain incomplete. But the freedom of this journey to create our own path is courtesy of the photo album as a collection of points of intersection between time and space where individuals, like Mather in her many roles or us as her audience, provide the filament that stitch one moment to the next. Thank you.